presentation and a little bit in between to go through them. So please feel free to use it as much as you'd like. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Scott Gilliland is from St. John, but spent most of his career working from St. John's, Newfoundland, and he currently resides in Amherst, Nova Scotia. He is one of two waterfowl biologists that work on ducks and geese in the Atlantic region of the Canadian Wildlife Service. Most of their work is focused on monitoring, and Scott runs the survey programs in Newfoundland and Labrador. Although he works on all aspects of waterfowl management, Scott's particular area of interest is the sea ducks, which he has been working on for about 35 years, and that is exactly what he is going to tell us about tonight. So without further ado, here is Scott.
Hi, everybody. Just want to thank everybody for letting me talk a little bit about sea ducks. I like to talk about them a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit more than just about, just give me a second here so I make sure I get the right presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about Scoaners first, and then I'm going to move on to Eiders and just introduce you to some of the work that we've been doing on the Scoter ducks and give you, an idea of where we work and how we catch the ducks, and a broad overview of some of the sort of big picture of information that we've been working up on these ducks. And then I'm going to follow up with a short talk on Eiders. So yeah, so I'm going to just, that's basically what I said. So I'm just going to introduce the scoters. I don't know if you're familiar with them. This is the three species of scoters that occur in North America. These are the males. So I'm not sure if people see my cursor, but the male with a black head and the yellow bill is a black scoter. In New Brunswick, some people might call them butterbills. There's the white-winged scoter in the center, and the surf scoter, or some people call them skunk heads on the right. These are the males. So just, introduce you to the ducks if you don't know them. So these are their surf scoters. They're a marine bird. They winter on both coasts of the continent, right from on the Pacific, right from the Baja all the way up through to the Aleutians. And on the East Coast, they winter, can't see my screen. They winter from Florida all the way north. Actually, there's a few actually wintering north, right to Newfoundland. And they breed in fairly remote areas across the northern part of the boreal forest, right across the continent, right from Labrador to Alaska. And they're the only one of the three scoters that are indigenous to North America. They only occur in North America. They don't have any counterparts in other parts of the world. Oh, sorry. And then there's the black scoter, and the black scoters. We think there's two distinct populations: an Atlantic population that breeds in eastern Canada and overwinters from Newfoundland south to Florida again, and then a Pacific population breeding primarily in Alaska and wintering down the east coast the Pacific coast as far as Washington State. And then finally, there's the white-winged scoters. It's the largest of the scoter species. They're quite striking bird with that eye stripe. And they're more of a Western breeder, although they winter on both coasts. And of the three species, they're the least abundant, and let's say the largest of the three species. And so they're mostly marine, but all the three scoters spend the breeding season in the interior of the continent, breeding on small lakes and water bodies, mostly along the boreal and tundra transition. So to talk a little bit about what we've been working on, we've been tracking these birds using satellite technology. So we've been using this Argos system. It's a polar orbiting satellite constellation. So they cross the poles, over the poles. And they're used to collect information from sensors. So information can be uplinked via radio transmission from the surface of the Earth to the satellite and then back down again. And they can also estimate the location of the transmitter. So we You may not know it, but you probably use this information daily, as a lot of our remote weather stations use the Argos system to transmit weather data from the sensors, the weather sensors, to the satellite and then back to Earth. They're also used a lot in the marine shipping and tracking shipping. But their other uses is for tracking wildlife. Oh. So this is a small radio tag that's designed to put in a sea duck. It weighs about 38 grams. There's many different versions of this. You know, it can go on everything from they actually have them down to about 5 grams and all the way up. There's something that you put on a whale for tracking a whale. And this one, this is the transmitter here. It's a small radio, and most of this is battery and antenna. So this is, I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's implanted this is a black scoter here under surgery. We have a few vets across the continent that specialize in putting these transmitters in birds. And this is Glenn Olsen. He's from the U.S. Geological Service in Patuxent, down in Washington, D.C. And you probably don't know Glenn, but if you know anything about hooping cranes and the recovery of hooping cranes, Glenn is kind of the designer of that big hooping crane recovery program. But he also specializes in putting these transmitters into the birds. So where we worked in Eastern Canada, we've worked all over. We put about 15 of those tags out in Labrador, out of near the community of Maine, on molting surf scoters. We put about 70 out on black scoters that were caught in the spring staging area in the Bay of Chaleur, both coasts of near Dalhousie on the Brunswick side, and we caught them in Saint-Omer on the Quebec side of the border. We put up another 70 tags out on white-winged scoters that are molt in Forthville in the estuary here in the St. Lawrence estuary. And we put about 90 tags in that same area out on birds caught in the fall staging areas at the time. So just a little bit about the sites. This is Maine. It's an Inuit community on the most northern community on the Labrador coast. So we're catching birds there during the molting period, and during the molt and waterfowl, they're flightless for about 30 days. They drop all their primary and secondary flight feathers, so they can't fly. So they're quite vulnerable. They tend to molt in fairly remote areas where there's not many predators. So, and in particular, we're interested in working here because there's large concentrations of these molting birds that were occurring in the shipping lanes, the proposed shipping lanes into that Voisey's Bay mine site. So that's what brought us to work up there. But I've worked maybe about 5 or 6 summers on the Labrador coast between the Backway and Maine on molting scoters. Just a bit about the study area. This is the camp we stay in. We stayed, I say, about 5 summers in that camp. This is a picture of the study area. It's quite a spectacular coastline. It's a fjord system. We're about 2/3 the way out the fjord, so it extends about 50 kilometers inland to the bottom of into the bottom or the river mouths, the river outlets, and it extends another almost 30 kilometers offshore to the outer extent. And in the inner parts of the bay, the fjords are very high. And where the scoters are is about 2/3 the way out the fjord system. It's most of the fjord is underwater. This is a male white wing. It's regrowing its flight feathers, so it's about halfway through its feather growth. So it's got maybe another 10 or 15 days before it can fly. And then the bottom picture here is just a picture of the net that we use for catching the birds. It's a gill net, especially designed for catching ducks. It's got a very small float line and a very light sink line. So the sink line is just enough to float the net. And if a bird gets entangled in the net, there's enough flotation that the bird just floats the net to the surface. So the other area where we've used this technique is in Forthville in the estuary. And I don't know if you can see it here, but this is a large flock of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 molting white wings. And this is what we're looking for. We deployed about 70 tags on those white wings in the Forthville area as well. So how do we catch them? Well, this is from the Maine. We use 2 large skiffs and a Zodiac, and we just patrol the coastline looking for molting flocks. We may travel 40 or 50 kilometers a day searching around for these flocks. So we use a Zodiac that works in close to the shore so we can corral the birds out of the shoreline. And how we catch them is with these gill nets. And so what we do is those 2 of the boats will hold the flock once we found one, and the net boat shoots out in front and runs we run out a net. We mark the net with the beginning of the net with a decoy, and we shoot it perpendicular to the shore and go offshore. So as we shoot the net, so that's the beginning of the net here near the shoreline, we set a couple of lines of decoys in the middle that brings the bird to the middle of the net, and we shoot at the complete net. It's not fixed; it's just free floating, and the net's about 500 feet long and about 13 feet deep. And then using the 3 boats, we slowly drive the flock to the net, and say they can't fly. And once they get to the net, we use a shotgun with a cracker shell, with a bear cracker shell, which will discharge, and it'll force the birds to dive into the net. And you can catch a lot of birds. At this one, I think this is 180 white wings in the gill net in this case. So in the fourth, this is in Forestville. Forestville, we work just from Zodiac, so we're landing all the birds onto the beach and quickly setting up an operation to ban all of those birds. In Maine, there's not many beaches, it's all rock, so all the birds are taken out of the nets in the boats. They're measured, and we determine the progression of molt by looking at how the feathers are growing. So lots of data is being entered as we go. So that's the molt captures. This is the captures in the staging areas. So this work was on black scoters in the Bay of Chaleur. It's in the spring, so the captures were happening here. There's about 170,000 black scoters that use the Bay of Chaleur in the spring, mid-April to mid-June. We spent about 10 days there. And there we're catching birds using decoys and over water mist nets, not gill nets. So I'll show you what that looks like in a sec. We also use the same technique for catching surf scoters in Forestville, the same site that we catch the white wings. But in this case, we're catching the birds on their southward migration. So as they're leaving the breeding areas and coming south, it's the first place where those birds congregate in large numbers. So in the fall, we're catching both adults and juveniles, young of the year. We're in the spring migration at Bay of Chaleur, we're just catching adults as they're moving into the breeding areas. So these, usually this work starts out with we drink beer and paint decoys, because every time we switch species, we don't have different species of decoys, we just repaint them to the species that we're capturing. So that's usually how we start it. I don't have many pictures of setting the mist net because all of the sets are made. Most of the birds are caught right at daylight. So the nets are usually set at 4 or 5 in the morning in the dark. They're 38 meters long, and they float on these decoys here are floating that pole. So each of these poles are being floated by the decoys, and the mist net is set perpendicular to the wind, and with a large decoy set in front, so just to the downwind of the net. And so what we try to do is get the birds to land in the decoys, and then a boat will come behind the decoys or the birds and flush them into the net, into the wind. So here you've got a couple of surf scoters heading for the net. And so the birds are removed from the net and caged and moved off to the vets for surgery. And say that we work with some great surgeons, some great vets from Quebec, from the Saint-Etienne, with the wildlife disease network vets and from the vets at Patuxent in the US. And they'll do surgeries just about anywhere. Here they're in a very nice, someone's garage. We've worked out of cabins and tents, and we've even had some vets that do some surgeries in hotel room bathrooms. So they're pretty versatile. And here they're doing a surgery on a surf scoter here, I think. So just what we're learning, if you go and look at a range map for black scoters, for example, this is the most recent one from Birds of the World, where you see that there's a Pacific and Atlantic breeding areas, and the core of the Atlantic is here in northern Quebec. But with the telemetry data, we've discovered this totally new breeding area, which is actually the core breeding area for the population that lies right along the tree line. It's right along the transition from the upper part of the boreal forest and low part of the tundra. And I spent actually the last 3 summers in this area right in here doing surveys as a result of this telemetry work. So we're redescribing the breeding ranges for the species. We've done the same thing for the white wings and the surfs. Mainly what we're into, we've combined our data with the Pacific data to look at the areas of overlap between the 2 populations, which is important for monitoring to know where the birds are coming from. And in the case of the white wings, we also have expanded their breeding ranges to the east a lot, further than what has been described historically. We also get information on their migrations, on their flight paths. So using the flight tracks on the migration, we're able to estimate the various migration corridors. This is just a couple of examples. One, the spring migration of black scoters that you can see leave, from northern Florida and along the eastern seaboard of the US. They all come up through the Bay of Fundy, cross over the isthmus right over top of my head here in Amherst, and they turn and head up into the Bay of Chaleur, where they stop for maybe 2 to 3 weeks and then disperse into the breeding areas. And then the return migration, they come through Concentrate and James Bay, where a lot of the birds will molt the black scoters, and then they take an overland route back down through the Ottawa River Valley. And this is just the other side is the migration route for white wings, which is a little different. We don't have as many radios out on white wings and much more dispersed migrations, but there is a spring route that brings them up through the Bay of Fundy and around, more not into the Bay of Chaleur, but on the north shore, the lower north shore of the Gulf, and then off into the breeding areas. But unlike the black scoters, there's another direct overland route that takes them up over Vermont and into over the western part of Quebec and into the western part of Canada for breeding. And then you can see their return route here. So this is the sort of information that we're getting from the telemetry studies. So the last bit is just the opposite side. This is looking at winter habitat use for the white-winged scoters. And we've been really successful using information from all of these telemetry studies in these assessments, environmental assessments of these large wind turbine sites that are in the US. So here we see from Long Island to Cape Cod, and the orange areas are the really important areas for white wings as identified by telemetry. And the blue areas are the lease sites for the wind turbines. And the design of those lease sites they're mostly not in the areas used by white wings, and that's because the white wings have been used to define where those lease sites can go in. So this has been a really successful use of the telemetry data, and we've got several examples of how that data's been used. Anyway, with that, I'm going to take a little break, and if anyone has any questions about the scoters, I can take some questions. If not, we can just move on to the Eiders.
I believe there is one question from Holly. Holly, I'm going to give you permission to talk if you want to ask your question to Scott directly.
Hi, Scott. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got you.
I was just wondering, when you were saying that the gill nets work by, if I understood correctly, you do some kind of shot or something that scares them into the dive and they go into the gill nets and that's where they're caught. Then you rescue them, tag them, or put them in cages to take them off. When you do that, and when there's such a big response, are there ever any scoters that drowned because you don't get to pull them out of the water and rescue them, either releasing them or capturing them before you and your staff you can get to them?
We've had a few drown, and when we started this work, we brought in someone from British Columbia has a lot of experience using these nets. We're not sure why the birds actually drowned. They were actually on the surface, but we got much better at it as we went. But we did lose a few birds. We typically would lose, maybe 2 or 3 out of 1,000 birds due to drownings. But and that's actually a relatively low rate for a lot of our monitoring programs. But there is mortalities associated with it. But in this case, we're also studying the energetics of scoters. So we were collecting birds as well. Most of them would have been shot for those collections, but we just incorporated the mortalities into our collections that reduced the numbers that we had to collect otherwise.
Can I ask a clarifying part B?
Yep.
So does that mean they dive, they're caught, but they can nonetheless still get back up and are captive waiting for you to manipulate, handle them and release them or cage them?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll just get back to that picture. I mean, this was a capture that was, well, there. Oh, it's going way faster than I thought it would go. There it is. So there you can see, all these birds are in the net and they're all on the surface, all the way up as far as you can see them. And you can see their heads are up and they're splashing around. Even this one here, that's his head up there out of the water. And there's the top of the net, and they say the net is 12 feet deep, and there's the lead line right there. And what happens, it's almost like a curtain. So as the birds hit the net and entangle, there's enough, they're buoyant enough that they just float to the surface. And it's almost like, as the way I picture it is like there's someone, when a bird goes in, it's just like drawing the curtains up. They just get pulled up, they come to the surface. And we think the mortalities are more a result of stress than anything. And so we try not to catch this many birds. Mostly my captures are usually about 20 birds per set. That's a reasonable number to get out of the net in a reasonable amount of time with the minimal, stress to the birds.
Thanks a lot. I have a much clearer picture now.
Yeah. I'll just get back to the...
There's another question from Roland. Roland, let me just find you on the list and you can ask your question.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering in terms of time, can you hear me, Scott?
Yeah, I've got you, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering in terms of migration, do they only migrate at nighttime?
No, they don't. And that's a good question. And we've not really looked at it too much. I've actually mapped the birds' movements through the Bay of Fundy, coloring their movements by the daylight. So if they're in darkness or in daylight. Main reason that we're doing that is because of the large wind farms that are in here, and we're concerned about, strikes. And most of the strikes that happen or collisions happen in periods of low visibility. So yeah, night times and also, ground fog. And this data, it's not, I present this like it's me, but there's actually a huge group of us from all over the continent that work on these programs. And we're combining all of our data right now from the telemetry work and providing it to a PhD student at Dalhousie who's looking at migration here over the isthmus, well, all the way from Point-de-Pro and maybe on the New Brunswick side mainly. He may also do the Nova Scotia side as well, using radar and these ARUs, these audio recording units, to try and track the movements of sea ducks, the timing, their height, their altitude of migration, And he's using the telemetry data as a starting point, you know, to understand the timing of the bird's movements and both during the day and the season. I don't know if that helps or not. But.
Thanks, Scott. Roland, did you have any follow-up?
Well, maybe you'll answer this with the Eiders, but also referring back to the isthmus. About a year or two ago, ND Power put noising devices on the power lines because we were having collisions with birds getting decapitated. Has there been any studies on the effectiveness of those devices on the power lines? You know?
No, and I was one of the ones that suggested that they do, you know, those devices on the power lines, and there's also, they haven't installed them. There's also a detector. They can detect bird strikes as well on those lines, but I'm not aware of any recent information. But this radar study that's being done, you know, is a result of those mortalities. So we'll get a much with the radar, we will get the altitudes of their movements, which is really important, you know, to understand the heights that these birds are moving, and also, as you say, the timing of the day, whether they're at night or not, and that may affect how those, well, some of them are lit, how they light things up and things like that, but less so for hydro lines than for the wind turbines. But yeah, we should have much better understanding at the end of this study.
Great, thank you.
We have a question from Ron. Ron, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
I got you, Ron.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's any recent work, if you've done any recent work as the Eiders move up, not Eiders, but scoters, well, Eiders too, but move up the Bay of Fundy, and then they switch over to go overland to Shediac Bay. Have you done any work there yet, or?
We've not done any work specifically, you know, on the Northumberland Strait side of New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. Mainly, well, except for Dalhousie, but those birds are tracked, you know, throughout their annual cycle. So all the scoters that were tracked are actually, you know, we see where they cross over. A lot of them stop over here by Port Algon and the Bay Bird Peninsula, and then, as you say, they hopscotch all the way up the coast to Shippagan and to the Bay of Chaleur. So we do have information, but we've not worked specifically in those areas.
Yeah, see, when I used to live in Memramcook,
Yep.
There were a lot of they seem to prefer to go
right up through the valley there.
Pardon?
They go right up through the Memramcook Valley. It's
Yeah.
one of the major flightways. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it certainly is. They seem to go up the Petticodiac and then quickly shift over the Memramcook Valley and then on to Shediac Bay.
Yeah, exactly.
Seems to be, from my observation over 14 years, that seems to be their preferred route.
Yep. And the Eiders, actually, the scoters only mainly make the one pass over, and that would be in the spring, but the Eiders actually can make 3 passes over, because there's a spring movement of the birds going north to the breeding areas, and then there's a molt migration, which is less, so it would happen in the summer, coming back, and then there's the fall migration back from the breeding areas as well. So there's, you know, the Eiders can make 3 passes a year over that, through those valleys and over the isthmus.
Yeah, I used to see them molting groups of Eiders in Johnson's Mills area.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thanks everyone for your questions. I don't see any more for the moment. So Scott, I think we can move on to Eiders, but to everyone, please continue asking questions in the chat, and we'll have lots of time at the end to take up questions about both Eiders and scoters.
Okay, so the next talk, this was what I thought I was going to present to begin with, and this is a talk that was given at I'll call it NADS here. It's a North American Duck Symposium, at the climate change session of that symposium a couple of years ago. So it's over on the other side. There's lots of us, again, that work on these things. So it's just a list of people that have all contributed to these ideas anyway. So this is mostly exploring ideas and what's happening with these eiders. So it's this is on eider ducks, a common eider, and you know they're all sea ducks, but the eider is much more marine than the scoters, in that the scoters spend part of their annual cycle in the terrestrial environment, in the inland areas, where eiders breed colonially on marine islands. So they're big. It's our largest North American duck. So they're actually more like a marine goose in terms of their demography, size, and because it's one of the few colonial nesting species of waterfowl in North America. There's actually 4 subspecies of common eiders that breed in Canada. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just to let you know, there's sedentaria, or the Hudson's Bay eider, that both breeds and winters in Hudson's Bay. They never leave. Most of them winter here on the Belcher Islands on the north side. We've done quite a bit of survey work in the Belchers in the winter there. There's a northern race, or borealis, that breeds in the eastern Arctic and northern Labrador. And they also breed in southwestern Greenland, and they winter in southwestern Greenland and around Newfoundland and along the north shore of the Gulf in Quebec. And there's a Pacific race of the common eider, V. nigra, that breeds primarily in the eastern Canadian Arctic and along the coastal slopes of Alaska, and they overwinter in the Aleutians, and they also overwinter in the northern part of Russia on the northwestern side of the Pacific. But we're going to be talking about the American subspecies that breeds from Groswater Bay in Labrador south to Massachusetts. And you know, if we were to step back about 20 years and you look at their distribution, most of those eiders would have been breeding in the St. Lawrence estuary here in Quebec. So Ron, a lot of the birds that you would see crossing over here would be going into the estuary. And the other area that we're breeding is Maine. So most of the birds would be breeding and would have been breeding in Maine and in the estuary in Quebec, and almost the remainder of them in southwestern New Brunswick and in parts of Nova Scotia, with relatively few birds along the north shore, northern Newfoundland and southern Labrador. And then in winter from Newfoundland south to Long Island, but the primary wintering area would be from Nova Scotia across southwestern New Brunswick down Maine as far as Cape Cod in Massachusetts. So that would have been the main wintering areas for the subspecies. But we had some initial reports of problems with these eiders. We really started to hear about this in 2006 with these mass die-offs of eiders in Massachusetts. And here you can see there's just, you know, hundreds of eiders littered across the beach, both alive, standing, and, you know, partially not very well, and dead on the beach. But kind of going back through the Beach Bird Survey records, realizing that this probably was initiated in 1998. And they've since done quite a bit of work. They've identified a new rhinovirus that they've associated with these mortalities. They don't know if it's absolutely causing a mortality, but a lot of the birds have been exposed to this new virus. It's called well-feet brave virus. There's been a bit of work done on ducklings, exposing eider ducklings to the virus, and it causes mortality in the ducklings. We know that. We don't know if it's causing the mortality in the adults. The next thing was molt bandings, and so these are field programs run by Department of Natural Resources in Nova Scotia, run by Randy Milton, and by Brad Island, who's the Maine State Fish and Wildlife. And here they're driving these large molting flocks of eiders for their banding operations. And what happened is, you can see there's lots of noise in the number of birds that were banded annually, and it's really, to make this work, it's dependent on having the right tide with the right weather at the right time. So sometimes things just don't come together and you don't catch birds. That's what's happening with that variation. But this decline is real. I mean, we've gone between, this was near the Lockport area, Nova Scotia, and this is Idaho in Maine. Between those two areas, we figured there was somewhere around 120 to 170,000 male eiders that molted at those sites. And there's a few thousand there now. So, but during the 2005 to 2010, these field operations were telling us there's some problem with the eiders. So this was about the same time that we were on the Wellfleet Bay virus, thinking that there might be some issues with eiders. So then there's not much monitoring data for this population, but there is pretty good data in New Brunswick. This is southwestern New Brunswick from the Maine border to St. John here. These are surveys that are driven primarily by Department of Natural Resources. Well, they're not natural resources anymore, but I still call them that in New Brunswick, and work that we do with them. So we both do these surveys. The dots are colored by the year. The size of the dot is the number of birds. And we're counting males, around the colonies is basically what we're doing. So the surveys are flown in the early part of May, every 2 or 3 years. And the numbers were pretty stable. We figured there was about 10,000 breeding pairs in southwestern New Brunswick. There was 8,000 or 9,000 on the repeatable segments of the survey. But you can see here, between 2000 and 2005, we just have gone into a precipitous decline. And we've gone from, we figured there was in the late 90s or to early 90s, maybe about 9,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs. And now we're detecting about 2,500 breeding pairs in southwestern New Brunswick. So very dramatic decline in the number of the breeding birds. I say there's not much monitoring data. But there are several large operational banding programs. So these are sites where the crews go on to the breeding colonies and catch birds and band them. Nova Scotia is a very long time series. They've been doing it almost every year since 1970. They stopped in 2010 because there's no longer enough birds to catch on the colonies to band. But basically what we do is during these banding operations, like in the Quebec crew, they're catching 1,400 to 2,000 adult females on the colonies every year. They're recapturing about 400 of those females have been banded previously. And we get about 1% of the birds that get banded every year get shot and reported by hunters. And this is a great source of information. They're using the recapture information and using the band recovery information, we can actually estimate growth rates. So where we didn't have monitoring programs, we've been using the banding data to try to extract growth rates. And that's this lambda value. This is a population growth rate. You may be more familiar with this is the finite rate of population increase. There's the instantaneous rate, which is more like your compounding interest rate, which is in a % per year. But the finite rate lambda is it just increments once a year. So if it's 1, it's stable. If it's above 1, it's increasing. If it's below 1, it's declining. So, and it basically just works because birds just breed once a year. So a lambda of 1.05, if you had 100 birds 1 year, the next year you just multiply it by 1.05 and you have 105 birds the next year and multiply that by 105. So it increases at a compounding rate. But you can see these are declining. The colonies in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Maine are declining at about 6 or 7% per year. So very dramatic decline. So this is the aerial estimate for New Brunswick, and the estimates from the banding data for the growth rates are the same for Nova Scotia and Maine, and which basically means that the colonies in Maine, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia are basically declining at the rate of adult mortality. And what we think is that there's basically no production. There's no new young coming into the population. Just another source. This is most of the work that I do is the winter surveys. So we work with Quebec region. The same sort of information. They're just colored by different years, and the size of the dot is the size of the flock that we saw, and every flock is georeferenced. And so we're able to, estimate trend for birds overwintering in Newfoundland and northern Quebec. It's been fairly stable at 300,000 to 400,000 birds detected on that survey every year. I started the Maritimes in 2006, not as a monitoring, just kind of a single survey. But then when the molt banders and the colony people and the situation in Massachusetts, we said, okay, well, we don't have much monitoring data. Let's just continue that winter survey in the Maritimes and see what's happening. So we started this survey back up in 2012. And that's the trend for New Brunswick. This is the trend for the number of eiders detected wintering in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. We're just over 70,000 birds in 2006. And in February 2019, we had about 17,000 between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So very dramatic declines in the number of birds detected overwintering in the Maritimes. Just if you look at just the New Brunswick part, it's most of that decline happened in the between 2006 2012, and it's stable or increasing now. But what's interesting in New Brunswick is that they're stable in Grand Manan. They've been pretty stable there. But we've almost lost all the overwintering birds from Passamaquoddy Bay and from basically from Pokologan down through to Passamaquoddy Bay. There's not many birds left overwintering in those areas. Nova Scotia is even worse. I mean, it's really a really shocking decline from almost 50,000 birds in 2006 to 8,000 or 9,000 birds detected in 2019. So just a very dramatic decline. The sort of the go-to guy for eider people is great black gulls. They eat eider ducklings, and so it just kind of fits the model of what we think what might be going on is the gulls are gobbling up all the ducklings. So say we also mentioned that we had concerns about the Wellfleet Bay virus. There's also been tremendous increases in bald eagles. We don't have great data in the Maritimes on trends in eagles, but they do in Maine, and they've been increasing at 8% per year for the last 12 to 15 years. And the whole coastline of Maine, where many of the colonies are just dotted with eagle nests now. There's also been mink and otter have been much more abundant with the collapse of the economy in 2008. The fur prices collapsed, and otters all of a sudden are all over the colonies in Nova Scotia. They weren't really much sign previously, but there is a fair bit of sign now. And people even talking maybe about cormorants as being issues. Anyway, I read this paper. It's winter ocean warming induces starvation of a predator and a prey. In this case, the predator is a sea star or starfish, and the prey is a blue mussel. And the situation here is, as the water warms, what happens is the mussels spawn in the latter part of the summer, early part of the fall, and as they spawn, they release huge amounts of nutrients. It's a huge energy expenditure. They usually get fat quite quickly afterwards. But when the water warms, there's lots of mortality of the mussels, and the mussels are very lean. It takes them a long time to recover from spawning. And for an eider that's eating these mussels, they're just basically eating an empty mussel. And it costs a lot of energy to crush and digest the mussel. So they're actually losing energy as they're eating these mussels. So we started looking at ocean warming, and just Google it. It's all over the place. Here's kind of 3 examples. Looking at warming of the Gulf of Maine, leading to collapse of the Maine cod fishery. There's another one by Arnaud Labrie looking at climate in lobster fisheries. And there's another one, the last one here by Sortia et al., looking at long-term declines in mussels across the Gulf of Maine. Just to give you an idea, this is from Andrew Pershing's paper on cod showing the warming trend in the Gulf of Maine. He actually analyzed the trend in the global oceans. So blue, that's getting cooler, red's getting warmer, and the Gulf of Maine is the area in the global ocean where it's warming the fastest. And you can see this it's been basically warming since as long as they've been monitoring. And you can see these incredible spikes in temperature that are occurring in some parts of in some seasons. And it's had very dramatic impacts on distributions of marine species. And the ones probably we're most familiar are right whales. And this is the white whale distributions that DFO's documented 1975 to 2015. So almost all the sightings are off Brahman, down off Briar, and down off George's Bank. But, you know, in 1 year, they completely abandoned those areas and moved into the Gulf. And what they've done, they've switched. They're here feeding on a species of marine copepods, and those are no longer abundant. And they've switched to feeding on a different species in the Gulf. So it's very dramatic changes that are happening in this system right now. Just another quick example, this is lobster catches in the New Brunswick side of the Bay of Fundy and Southwest Nova, just incredible. I mean, we had a lobster license in our family back here. I wish I still had it now, because the catches have gone even in the 90s from about 1,200 tons to 12,500 tons. So just, there's incredible changes happening in this system right now. There's similar changes on the Nova Scotia side as well. It's quite interesting that the changes are occurring. This is out of Arnaud Lebris' paper, and it's looking at the indices of recruitment for lobsters. So the blue is the Goldilocks zone. This is what it would look like 1990 to 1995. So down here in the Gulf Stream, the water's too warm, too cold in the Bay of Fundy for lobsters. So, you know, the best areas were down through off the New England states, Southwest Nova, and up into the Gulf. This is 2000 and 2005, things are warming up, Bay of Fundy is getting better. This is the current state, it's completely changed where it's much better in the Bay of Fundy. Too warm now in Massachusetts for lobster. And this is the projection, what it might look like in 2050. So the Bay of Fundy is going to be quite good. And lobster, you know, there's going to be big changes. There's not going to be so good on the straight sides of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's going to be Newfoundland, Labrador, and the North Shore where the lobster are probably going to move to. So just an example how this system is changing and may change with these warming waters. And this is just out of the Sortia et al. Paper. These are sampling sites from the border, the Brunswick, Maine border here, down to Massachusetts, where they've been sampling mussels. And it's showing, this is the historical estimates of mussels, contemporary estimates. There's been a 75% decline in the abundance of mussels across the Gulf of Maine. So really, and this is an example, this is Indian Point off St. Andrews in 2010. It was a field crew working out there collecting some mussels. We've actually had some work done here in 1986 where these mussel beds here off Indian Point were measured. We estimate there was, you know, 34.5 million mussels in those 3 beds there that were measured. I walked those beds and hoping to repeat that study in April 2016, and there were no mussels. I counted 10 in that whole on that whole red line, which should have intersected several major mussel beds. I talked to the research scientist in St. Andrews at DFO. He put a drone in the air and flew a bunch more mussel beds, all these star sites where we knew there were mussels, and he didn't find any mussel beds. So we really think some of the major impacts that are happening are because of the changes in the abundance of mussels. So we go back to our winter survey data and just kind of focus a little bit to the north and focus on this area here from Ile de Madeleine here in the Gulf across the southwest coast of Newfoundland over to the Burin Peninsula, including the French islands, the St. Pierre-Miquelon. If we look at that area, it's been really some spectacular changes. So this is the trend for the Maritimes, this big decline. And here we see, you know, between 2012 and 2017, an enormous increase in the number of eiders that are overwintering in that little blue box, mainly in the Ile de Madeleine. So it's gone from 35 to 40,000 eiders overwintering in that blue box to our last survey, I think it was 2018, 19. there was almost 80,000. So what we think is happening is many of these eiders are now short stopping. They're actually not migrating all the way down into Maine and Massachusetts, but a lot of them are short stopping in the Gulf, where there is now open water. A lot of these areas would have been ice covered, not on the south coast of Newfoundland, sorry, but the mainland certainly were ice covered. Sorry, a bit of a dog's breakfast. This is looking at harvest distribution. So each one of these bars would be, the harvest of eiders in each year, and the color would be from each jurisdiction. So Massachusetts, Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Rhode Island. Don't bother looking at that figure too long. I've broken it up a little bit so we can see the patterns here. This is Massachusetts, Maine, Nova Scotia, Quebec. If we draw a line here just for reference, about 2010, and we look in the US, prior to 2010, most of the harvest of eider was happening in Maine. And after, most of the harvest is happening in Massachusetts. And the same things happened in Canada. In Canada, before 2010, most of the harvest was in Nova Scotia, and now it's in Quebec. So it fits what we're seeing in the survey data. Unfortunately, we don't have any survey data in the US, so that's what we're trying. And it fits anecdotal. I mean, eiders are no longer many wintering in Maine, but there seem to be actually pushing further south, all the way down, many more birds all the way down to Rhode Island. So where are they gone? Well, I think there's a couple of different things happening. We're seeing declines in eiders breeding in the southern part of the range, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Maine. I think those are gone. There's significant declines for eiders wintering in the Maritimes. I'm not sure those birds are all gone. Some of them may be just to the north of us in the Gulf. So, but say in Canada, the winter survey data suggests that there's been a northern shift in the distribution, and the harvest data also shows that similar shift in Canada, but also suggests there may be a southern shift in their distributions in the US. And so that's the end of the talk.
Thank you, Scott. I don't see any questions at the moment, but oh wait, I see a hand up. Tony Diamond, you can go ahead. Tony, are you there?
I'm here. I'm now unmuted.
Yeah, there you
Can
go.
you hear me? Okay,
Hey,
sorry
Tony.
about that. So thanks very much, Scott. That was great. What happened? Are the eiders that are wintering in the Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia, are they local breeders, or have they come, or did they used to come from further north? And are those eiders that are now wintering mostly off Newfoundland and Gilliland, are they northern breeders, or have they bred locally?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we have not got a handle on that yet. I mean, the older data, from Peter Hickman's work, where he banded lots of birds on the wolves in New Brunswick, suggested, maybe about 30 or 40% of those birds on the wolves are actually overwintering in St. Andrews. That was between, birds that were shot, and there were also many birds that were marked with pieces, so reciting. So it suggested a good chunk of those birds were overwintering in New Brunswick. Right. Nova Scotia, I'm not sure. I think there's lots of migrants that come through Nova Scotia. There are also lots of migrants in the early part that come through New Brunswick. In Newfoundland, that's funny. I got my text is going here now. There's the outfitter in Port aux Basques, and he's going crazy over there right now. There's so many eiders, and we've been collecting heads from hunters from eiders, hunters in Saint-Pierre-Miquelon and in Île-de-Madeleine and in Anacostia, not Anacostia, sorry, in the Mingan Archipelago. And historically, about 50% of the eiders that are overwintering on the south coast of Newfoundland were dress rye. The other part were northern borealis. On the north shore of the Gulf, there were about 90% borealis, so very few dress rye. We didn't have a measure in Île-de-Madeleine, but we do now. we thought they were mainly borealis based on the satellite telemetry data, but they are almost all dress rye now. I was on the south coast of Newfoundland last year. They're almost all dress rye. And the head data that's coming in right now is suggesting that it's switched from about 50% dress rye to about 80 to 90% dress rye on the south coast of Newfoundland. So it does suggest that the dress rye are further north. We have, I don't know what state we're in, but we're also working at this through genetics. So we've collected reference samples from Ungava Bay all the way to Massachusetts from colonies, and we've been collecting reference samples from, the wings that come into our harvest survey. For the last 7 years, we've collected every eider wing, and the idea will be to try and look at how those, the affiliation between the harvest and the breeding area and how those things are changing. So I might be able to answer that question a little bit better in a year or two, but we're working on that right now.
Yeah. You raised the question of gulls eating eider ducklings, and of course we know all about that, don't we? Various histories.
Yeah.
One striking thing though is the gulls have gone down too.
Yeah.
So I was back on the walls a few years ago, in the summer in July, and I was really taken aback with how few eiders and how few gulls there were. It was very striking. So on Flat Pot, I found one old herring gull nest, no other gull nests. Didn't see many gulls around at all, and saw very few eiders.
Yeah,
It was really quite striking.
The surveys are saying about 45 male eiders on the wolves now, and that would have been down from about 1,000 in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure about the counts on gulls. On blackbacks, there's maybe 200, 250 nests in the 80s. And my memory is there maybe 12 or 1,500 herring gulls. And the Flat Pot would have been a big chunk of the herring gulls were on Flat Pot.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very striking.
Yeah. No, the changes are really dramatic. I mean, we don't see them. I don't think that the things that are happening in the marine system, but I mean, we're really worried about these terrestrial systems. But the birds, or not the birds, marines are responding, species respond to those temperature. They're very sensitive to changes in temperature. So
Right.
Yeah.
Follow up, if I may. In Passamaquoddy Bay, the increase in the bald eagles is very striking. So Dix Island, for example, used to have a lot of eiders and a lot of gulls of both species, and it has very few now.
Yeah,
Again, we were there a few years ago, there's any number of immature bald eagles sitting around waiting for a meal.
Yeah, I think for eiders, it's like a perfect storm.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Tony. We have a question from Blake. Blake, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
I've got you, yeah.
I've heard that the limit for eider hunting in Nova Scotia has been reduced. I'm from Newfoundland, and I'm just wondering, is there any thoughts about that here?
No, and I did the regulations for Newfoundland for a long time, so I was the one responsible for reducing the bag in the season way back in '97, and we finally got all of those restrictions removed as a result of the surveys that you see here. And there seems to be the situation for eiders in Newfoundland is good right now. Certainly for breeding on the Northern Peninsula. I don't know if you've been up there, or the south coast of Labrador. I've been working in those areas since 1992, and you wouldn't recognize it in the spring any longer. There's so many eiders. So we've removed all the bag restrictions in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I don't foresee there being any restrictions put in place unless we have a relatively good monitoring program. If we see problems, we may bring in some restrictions. But yes, we did reduce the bags, this length of the season. It was a long season, almost 107 days in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It's been reduced to 60 days, and it's been reduced from I can't remember, 4 birds to 2, and only one of the 2 can be a female. All the evidence we have suggests that hunting is not playing a role in the decline of the eiders. It's something else that's going on. We have a great source of information from the banding data. We can actually look at the harvest pressure, and there's no indication that the harvest is the issue. But harvest does affect survival, and we know it lowers survival a little bit. So we're hoping by reducing the harvest pressure that it may give a little bit more room for recovery, because it just means the population is not going down quite as fast. But our concern now is, I mean, most of the harvest in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, it's almost gone. There's not much harvest to reduce. There's not much left. But there is still significant harvest in the US, and they brought in some restrictions. I think in 2016, they weren't effective. Their harvest actually went up during the restrictions. So they're just looking at restricting harvest in the US again, probably in the next year or 2. Maybe that's more than you want to hear, but that's what's happening with harvest. Yeah.
Right on. Thanks. If I can follow up there about your point about the ice conditions, we hunt the eider ducks out of Musgrave Harbour on the northeast coast of Newfoundland around the Wadham Islands. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yep.
This year, and I'm sure you're familiar with the lack of ice that there is this year.
There's no ice. I just looked at the map. It's incredible. There's no ice anywhere.
It's terrible, and that's kind of what we depend on to get the numbers of the ducks to come up from the north. And this year, well, there's been a nice few ducks all year, but my grandfather has been hunting the eiders, well, all of his life, and we've noticed a pattern that it seems like the young ducks come up later in the fall, and then as the winter goes on, you get the older ducks to come up. But it seems like this year, there's been a lot of young ducks around right from the start of the season, right up until now. And it just seems like the older ducks are starting to show up within the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and that's too bad. I mean, we do that winter survey in Quebec and Newfoundland every 3 years. I'm supposed to be just finishing that survey now. So we're stuck here now on the ground. But yeah, it would have been a very interesting year to fly. And we can see that, we don't do a lot with the age. It's hard to do from the aircraft, but we actually can see these young birds, young males in those flocks. It would have been quite an interesting year to fly with all that open water.
For sure.
But I can't answer any questions, about what's going on there right now.
Perfect. Thank you then.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Blake. We have gone over time, which I think is an indication that people really enjoyed the talk. If Scott wasn't able to get to your question, I will email them to him and get back to you. Thank you, Scott, for that fantastic presentation. And thank you to everyone for coming and participating. There's been excellent engagement, excellent questions. Before I let you all go, I want to let everyone know about the future webinars we have coming up in the series. We still have 2 more. On March 24th, we have our final webinar style talk about the life and times of owls in New Brunswick, given by Nelson Poirier of Nature Moncton. And then I am happy to announce that we have a date for our panel discussion on the state of biodiversity in New Brunswick that has been officially scheduled for April 13th at 6:30 p.m. And that is a Tuesday. So it's the same time as the past webinars, but note that this one will be on a Tuesday, not a Wednesday.